What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living in Iraq and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And in 2023, we have seen a wave of individuals from the mafia come home from prison after serving short and long sentences. We've seen several individuals in the Colombo crime family come home, most notably Tommy Schatz Joeli. Someone recently came in from prison as well from the Colombo crime family after he was given a 70-month sentence. Joe Amato, at one point, according to Gangland News, was regarded as the king of Staten Island for the Colombo crime family. He has an interesting story and has spent a good amount of his life in prison. The story of Joe Amato and his son, Joe Jr. Next on the sit down. Joseph Amato was born in December of 1958. He would grow up in and around Diker Heights and Bay Ridge in Brooklyn. Now, Amato's father, Bernard, was not a street guy. However, it was said that throughout his life, he had come up and even into Joe Amato's tenure in the mafia. His father had always been around a lot of mob haunts. Now, not a lot's known really about the early life of Joseph Amato, particularly in his teenage years. However, at one point in the 70s, he is coming up as a loan shark. And look, throughout the life of Joseph Amato, he has always been a loan shark. He would come under the tutelage of Colombo, Queens heavyweight Pasquale Patty Amato. Now, interestingly enough, there is no relation between Pasquale and Joe Amato. They just happen to have the same last name. Now, for anyone that's not aware who Patty Amato is, Patty Amato was said to be made in the early 80s. And he would actually be placed in the crew at one point of Colombo heavyweight Donnie Shack's Montemurano. Pasquale Amato was particularly close to Little Vic Arena. They were both from Queens, and they'd kind of come up together and were both heavily involved with different rackets. Now, Pasquale Amato had a pretty solid crew in the Colombo crime family. According to Gregory Scarpa, by the late 80s, he was a Capo regime in the family. Now, in the crew of Patsy Amato were the likes of Louis Bobo Malpise, Robert D'Onofrio, Tommy Acera, and it was said that the right-hand man to Patsy Amato was upstart Joseph Amato. As I said, Joey Amato was particularly adept in gambling and loan sharking. He had a huge loan book in Brooklyn. Now, Joe Amato at this point in the late 80s was not a made member, but he was on his way to being fast-tracked as a member of the Colombo crime family. He would work out of a social club in Brooklyn, in and around 71st Street and Fort Hamilton Parkway. Now, at the time, Joseph Amato was kind of creating his own little crew, if you will. One of his top guys was a person called Giovanni John Cerbone. Amato was doing some good things, and he was also said to be involved not only with loan sharking, but video poker machines as well. Also, inside his little crew were two brothers called Richard and Tommy Capo, as well as a person most notably known as Chris. Now, Joe Amato, by 1990, according to Greg Scarpa and an FBI file, would become a made member of the Colombo crime family. Now, by that point, it was said that Joe Amato would directly be placed back into the crew of his mentor, Patsy Amato. Now, interestingly, in that same FBI file, Greg Scarpa would say that by that point, it was common knowledge on the street that the boss of the family was Little Vic Arena. And a lot of people really on the street, look, the truth is, Carmen Persco had control of the family, but other upstart people were coming up and beginning to realize that they had power on the street. And most people at that time recognized Arena as kind of the street guy, right? And then this would lead into the Colombo War because Persco gets wind of this. He's not happy. He sends shooters after Vic Arena to his Cedarhurst, Long Island home. They miss Arena. Arena tries to calm and create peace. That doesn't happen. A war ensues. Now, obviously, anyone in the Colombo crime family that was on the street at that point was involved with the war, and that was no different with Joseph Amato. But Joe Amato would be involved with the war in several different ways. Now, in and around November of 1991, obviously, loyalists from both sides began killing each other. Now, as I said, Amato was loyal to his capo, Patsy Amato, who was loyal to Victor Arena. So Amato was on the Arena faction side. Now, on December 8th, 1991, an Arena loyalist called Vincent Fusaro would be killed while he's putting up Christmas lights outside of his Brooklyn home. Now, on the same night, Amato crew member Louis Bobo Malpese's son, Jimmy Malpese, is shot. Now, he's not killed, but he's hit and survives. Now, Malpese is furious. He goes to Patty Amato and says, I need to avenge my son, which he does because Malpese, as well as Joey Amato and associates of those crews, begin stalking members of the Persco faction who they believe shot at Malpese's son. Now, one of the people they settle on in wanting to kill is a person called Francis B.F. Guerra, as well as another individual called Anthony Ferrara. Now, the hit team that's assembled with Malpese and Amato stalk Guerra to a bagel shop in the area of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. B.F. Guerra owned the bagel shop, and they assumed he would be there. Now, that night, the hit team that was with Amato and Malpese was a father-son team called Anthony and Chris Liberatore. Now, both Liberatores were associates, but they had taken on work for the mafia, and they were trying to prove that they were worthy of the job. Now, Liberatore would tell court many years later that he had been around the mob his entire life, and he was always trying to impress gangsters in Brooklyn and the Colombo family. Now, they would find that they believed Guerra was at this bagel store. So they go to the bagel store. There's cars parked. Liberatore is sent inside the bagel shop. Now, I want to talk about what was said inside the bagel shop. Here you can see a police detective dealing with the scene because this would become a crime scene. At one point, Liberatore would say, quote, I went in. I had on a black leather coat. He said, I looked for the owners and then asked a youth that was standing at the counter if he had seen them. Now, the youth identified as a person called Matteo Speranza, who was 17 years old, looked at me and said, what are you looking at them for them for? Liberatore would then say the youth then began leaning under the counter. He would say, quote, I didn't know why he was leaning down, so I just shot him 4, 5, maybe 6 times. We then dumped the car, and I laid low for a couple of days. Now, Liberatore would shoot an unsuspecting youth that worked at the bagel store. He was not a mobster, but he claimed that the kid was reaching for a gun. It turned out that the kid wasn't reaching for anything. He was just scared. And Liberatore, out of just freaking out, shot the kid. Now, it was said that Joey Amato and the crew got rid of the weapon and the car. Now, in and around April of 1992, things start falling apart for Victor Arena. He is arrested, as well as Patsy Amato are arrested for the 1989 murder of Amato crew member Tommy Osera. So Arena's off the street. That would kind of almost lead to the end of the war, as well as Patty Amato's off the street. Joseph Amato is made acting capo of the Amato crew. They don't even have to change the name. It's still the Amato crew. It wouldn't last long, though, because by 1993, Joseph Amato, alongside other members of the Colombo crime family, including Bill Cotolo, are indicted by the federal government. Now, for Joe Amato, this would lead to MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center. Now, this has widely been talked about. This is around the time when they put all the Colombo members in the same unit. And guess what happens? The Colombo crime family takes over the prison, and it looks like a scene straight out of Goodfellas. In fact, the BOP was kind of slapped on the wrist for this and why you would allow this sort of thing to go on. So Amato was allowed to hang out with the rest of his crew. He was in there with Cotolo, and the war had pretty much died down by this point. Now, Amato would ultimately have to go to trial on orchestrating the murder as well as for racketeering charges. The problem by this point for the Colombo crime family was Big Sal Michiata had decided to cooperate against the Colombos, and he, according to himself, had confessions, and he had wiretap conversations where Liberatore, the shooter in the Speranza case, was essentially telling him that he was involved with that. Ultimately, Michiata would testify, and in 1995, Joe Amato and Bobo Malpise got the bad news that the shooter in the case, Chris Liberatore, decided to cooperate as well, alongside his father, Anthony Liberatore. So this was not good news for most notably Bobo Malpise. Now, Malpise was involved in another murder as well, sadly. He was involved in the shooting of going after another member of the Persco faction, and that would lead to the murder of an unwitting teenager. So Malpise would end up going to prison. He would be hit with 75 years and would die in 2003. Joseph Amato would ultimately get hit with 18 years in federal prison. He was 36 years old at the time of his guilty verdict. And look, by this point, Joe Amato had his own family. He was out in Staten Island. He had just had a son, Joe Jr., who was born in 1993. So remember, Joe Amato's son at the time of his incarceration is under a year old. Okay, so the son had nothing. He had no one around him. The only people around him were his father's, associates. Now, upon Amato's incarceration, a lot of his crew is put under the tutelage of Wild Bill Cotolo, who, as we know, beats the rap and is acquitted in his case. He goes back to the streets. Now, for Amato, he would have several members on the street that would kind of handle business and take care of his son, including John Sorbonne, as well as a person called John Floridia. Remember, though, Amato's kid has no father around. That's tough on him, right? You don't have your father around. All you know is mobsters. That's all you're involved with. Joe Amato would stay in prison all the way until 2009, where he'd serve about 15 years. He would be released on April 3rd of that year. Now, upon coming back to Staten Island and Brooklyn in 2009, he obviously realizes that the streets are totally different than when he went in. You go to prison in 95 and you come out in 2009, a lot has happened, not only in the streets, but in the world in general. Technology is huge. The internet is popular now. Social media is around. September 11th that happened. Like, a lot had happened. That's a crazy time to go to prison because a lot had happened during his incarceration. The Colombo crime family also looked a lot different as well. By this point, Joe Amato comes home to a guy called Ralph DeLeo running the family. Now, DeLeo was from Connecticut. He was personally appointed by Carmen Persco as the street boss for 1 year until he was in prison. And then it was just kind of a ruling committee for a while. Joe Amato would head right back to the streets and quickly asserted himself as a loan shark again. He creates a new group around him. He starts loaning money out. He's shaking people down. And he starts making money again quite quickly. Now, I want to discuss a pretty interesting comment at one point made by an individual in the Lucchese crime family. That was done on the show, according to Sitdown News' John Panisi. He would say that Johnny Sideburn Sorella would make a very interesting comment to him at one point about Joseph Amato. Sorella would say in reference to Amato, quote, "He's a nice guy, not too smart. He has all these guys running around him around the island like wild fucking Indians. He's going to get arrested." And that's exactly what the early to mid 2010s were for Joe Amato. He was running around like a lunatic. And by this point, not only is he running his own crew, but his son, Joseph Amato Jr., is starting to run around in the streets. By 2014, Amato is making a ton of money. Obviously, he's got a lot of money on the street. He becomes one of the biggest loan sharks in Staten Island, and he essentially runs the island for the Colombo crime family. He is the only Capo regime in that area. Now, by this point, his son, Joe Amato Jr., is going to St. John's University. Now, this is a later photo of him, and I'll tell you what would happen to him. But he would be enrolled at St. John's, but he decides in 2015 to drop out and begin working alongside his old man. Now, at one point, he would tell the court, quote, that he yearned for his dad's approval. Now, remember, he had spent his entire life up until his mid to late teens without his father. His father was in prison. All he knew was what his dad wasn't there for, and he was just around mob guys his whole life. I've always said, guys, look, a lot of these people's futures are already created for them when they come out and they become kids and become men. They're generally going to follow in the footsteps. And even in the case of Joe Jr., I mean, he was in college. He did some normal things, but, the calls to the streets were too important. Now, for Joe Amato Jr., he would be involved in a bizarre situation at one point in and around 2016. At one point, he would be at a Staten Island nightclub where an individual called Neil DeVito and him got into a bit of an argument. Through different things. At one point, DeVito confronts Amato for insulting a woman at one point at a bar. Amato Jr. would tell Neil DeVito, quote, "Back off. Do you know who the fuck my father is?" Which we have all heard before. That is the worst comment. In fact, many people in Staten Island make that comment a lot. Crazy comment to make. Just shows that you're a complete imbecile. So Joe Amato pulls the "Do you know who my father" card is. Now, at one point, the following day, Neil DeVito is lured to a location where Amato Sr., Amato Jr., Tom the Plumber Sorsha, as well as Anthony Silvestro give out a beating to Neil DeVito. Neil DeVito is beat up in the street and nothing good happens. Now, at one point, Joe Amato Sr. says to the bloody DeVito, quote, "Do you know who the fuck I am?" DeVito responds, "No." Amato Sr. would then say, "You don't know who the fuck I am?" before telling his crew to finish the job. So the Amatos have a whole, thought of, they use the "Do you know who I am" quote a lot. Now, according to DeVito, he didn't know who the fuck either of them was, and he didn't care seemingly. So again, they're pulling punches. They're doing a lot of reckless shit on the island. And Amato is directly involved with his son in doing things. Now, I also want to talk about another reckless individual that Joseph Amato was hanging around with, his childhood friend, this guy, Benjamin Bafalco. Now, this story is very funny, okay? One day, Bafalco gets a call or makes a call to Joe Amato Jr., where he essentially says that he can fix a basketball game involving Wagner College. Now, Wagner College is a low-level D1 school, but by this point, they had lined games in college basketball. And Bafalco had targeted a date with St. John's where they were going to play each other. St. John's was a 17-point favorite. And, he had believed that Wagner was going to get blown out. And he would call Amato and essentially say that he had players on the take. Now, this is fascinating. Bafalco at one point in a tape-recorded conversation 4 days before the game, would tell Joe Amato Jr. that he had, quote, been dreaming about fixing a college basketball game since he was in his freshman year at Wagner. And that he had told Amato that he'd already paid 3 Wagner starters $7,500 to throw the game, and that he was, quote, going to bet 50 grand on the game. Now, Bafaka would say, quote, they're my fucking boys since fucking freshman year, and we've always talked about it. There was never an opportunity because Wagner never had a spread on its games. Now, Bafaka would say at one point, let me also explain the scenario. Wagner's 4-4. That's their record. They're playing St. John's. St. John's is 9-0. If you guys lose by 1 point or if you guys lose by 100, it don't make the fucking difference. You're going to lose to St. John's. They're fucking unbelievable this year, St. John's. They might even make the NCAA tournament. Now, we would ultimately find out that Benjamin Bafako didn't have anybody on the take. He may have known a player, but he never communicated nor had any involvement with giving them money to throw a game. Now, we would hear a funny conversation between Thomas Sorsa and Joe Amato. At one point, basically, Sorsa would say that he didn't trust the scheme and he wasn't going to bet a fucking dime on it. Sorsa would say, quote, I'm not touching it personally. I wouldn't trust the game. Now, interestingly enough, you're probably wondering whatever happened in the Wagner-St. John's game. Well, St. John's was a 17-point favorite, and at halftime, they were up just 1 point. So Wagner fought. They played well in the game. Now, in the end, St. John's would win by 15. They didn't cover the spread. Now, we had hoped that Bafako didn't actually bet on it because he would have lost. So it's actually quite funny because none of it actually happened. And he would ultimately be involved in an indictment that we'll get into in just a second. But it wasn't just Amato Jr. that was running hijinks. According to the federal government, in and around 2016, Joseph Amato Sr. would be love struck. He would install a GPS device on his ex-girlfriend's car at one point to track her every move. She would then locate it and put it on the back of an MTA bus. Now, to instill more fear into his ex-girlfriend, Amato would email her, quote, this is my island, not yours. I have eyes all over you. I'm called what it is, a made man, I'm called a man's man, not a made man. Anyone could end up in jail. I don't wish it on anyone, especially weak men who could never deal with it. I thrived there and anywhere I go. So he's instilling that he's a guy, he's a man's man, he's a gangster, he's the guy that runs the island, he has eyes everywhere, he can handle jail, he doesn't really care, blah, 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 blah. As well as he's loan sharking, running a criminal enterprise, doling out beatings to guys who don't care who he is, all sorts of stuff. And again, he is strengthening the comment made by Johnny Sideburns that Sideburns was right when he said he's running around like an Indian. He's doing whatever he wants. It would all come undone, though, for Joseph Amato, as well as his son, Joe Amato Jr. And in 2019, he, alongside other members and associates of the Colombo crime family, would be hit with a wide-ranging indictment ranging from racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, and sports bribery. Now, ultimately, Joseph Amato would plead guilty, and in 2021, he would be sentenced to 70 months in federal prison. He had already served a couple of years, and in August of 2023, just recently, he would be released to a halfway house in Philadelphia. In January of 2024, he will be out of the halfway house and back on the street. Keep in mind, Joe Amato is only 64 years old, and he has spent about 20 years of his life in prison. A lot of his adult life has been in prison. His son, Joe Amato Jr., would ultimately in 2021 be hit with 3 years of probation, essentially supervision. Now, I want to talk a little bit about his behavior in court because I have to admit, I mean, look, I don't feel bad a lot of the time for these people, but I will say, in learning a lot about Joe Amato Jr., I do ultimately feel kind of bad for him. I think as a kid, he made some really dumb decisions, but look, the truth is he was young, and I think he really just, as he said, yearned for his father's approval. Joe Amato would actually ultimately go back to college. He would make the dean's list multiple times and earn a bachelor's degree in business management from St. John's University in May of 2021. At the time of his sentencing, he was working towards a master's degree at the CUNY campus on Staten Island, where he has, quote, top level grades, according to his lawyer. He would say at one point that he made a very dumb mistake, and his attorney, James Fracaro, would note that he has straight A's in most of his classes and is also maintaining an employment at a sprinkler company where his boss said he does very good work. He has essentially said, Joe Amato Jr., that he has given up a life of crime. And we can believe that because since then, he has not been heard from whatsoever. From what I understand, he quietly lives in Staten Island. And I want to relate this, guys, to a recent video I did that I actually want to apologize for. A couple of weeks ago, I released a video about John Gotti, the grandson of John Gotti Sr. I think sometimes in this channel, I get a little too interested in the lives of these people. But the young kids of these people, even though, or grandkids of these people, even though they go into the life, who am I to unearth some of their haunts? People like Joe Amato and John Gotti are just trying to move on in their life. And I should focus more sometimes on the history and of actual criminals like Joe Amato's father and leave him out of it. Look, I will mention the things that Joe Amato did, but who am I to hold on? Sometimes you have to let go, and good for him for moving on in his life. What his dad will do going forward, I have no idea. But I think sometimes when you get some of these younger kids like Amato or Gotti that make some mistakes when they're kids, I don't think they should be defined by them forever. As I said, Joe Amato is out of the game from what I've seen. We'll see what his father does next. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.